Back to the Friday 5 for November 8th, 2024. My name is Andrew Ayers. I'm a business law and estate planning attorney with offices in Edina, Minnesota and New York City. Today, we're going to take a quick look at 5 questions from the week, try to get them answered in about 5 minutes for you. So let's get started. Question 1 this week, can I create a holding company LLC? Well, this is a pretty common strategy that I run into with my clients. And if you're not familiar with the idea of a holding company LLC, what that means is you can set up essentially an LLC that can own other LLCs that are operating below it if you look at it like a pyramid. So we often come into this when we have real estate LLCs. So we would have, let's say, 3 different properties and each of them in their own LLC. And then we create a holding company LLC that would be the owner of each of the 3 sub LLCs. So it's a pretty common strategy that we run into, and I had a good call this week with a caller who actually had even set up the flow chart just the way I would have set it up, and he was actually going to then have a trust own his holding company LLC. Now, the important part of this process, though, is you have to work with your accountant because there are restrictions as to what kinds of LLCs can own an interest in other LLCs. So you can't just automatically do an S-Corp election and have it, an S-Corp as your holding company and S-Corp as your individual LLCs. So we want to make sure that we involve all the professionals in the process. So when you're doing that holding company LLC, we can set up the legal piece, but when it comes to the tax piece, make sure you speak to your accountant, make sure you speak to a CPA, make sure you get that tax advice so that you know what's the proper way to set it up from a tax perspective. Question 2 this week, when can I get a bank account for my new LLC? And so when we're setting up an LLC, there's usually a whole set of things we all want to get done at once. And the question is, what is that specific order? So normally the order will be we set up our LLC, we file it with our local state, then we go to the IRS and get an EIN, a tax ID number for that LLC. And then at that point, you can then go to the bank and get a bank account with the LLC because they're going to want to see that EIN, that taxpayer number. And in some cases, the bank will actually want to see your operating agreement or corporate resolutions. So when we're looking at those steps, those often come as the 4th thing we do. We file with the state, we get our EIN, we open the bank account, and we work on the operating agreement. And the reason that's 4th is because that usually takes a little bit of time to go through all the language and get things signed. But sometimes as part of that bank account process, we need to make sure that we have to have an operating agreement or corporate resolutions in place. And now we have a new 5th step as of January 1st, and that's your beneficial ownership interest filing with FinCEN. So if you filed in 2024 or before, if you're before 2024, you have to file your BOI by the end of 2024. If you file in 2024, you have 90 days. And then starting January 1st, 2025, you will have 30 days from filing your LLC to file your beneficial ownership interest statement. Question 3 this week, can I use a trust to own my LLC? So we're going back to that first question we had where we were setting up a holding company and the caller wanted to know whether we could then use a trust to own that LLC. And so as a general idea, yes, you can. You need to check with your specific state laws, meaning the state where the LLC is set up and the state where your trust is going to be set up. But normally what we can do is take that LLC and have the membership interest be owned by the trust. And so the trust is the member of the LLC, and then you can decide who's going to manage the LLC. You, as the trustee of the trust, can be the manager of it. You can hire a third party. We call that a manager-managed LLC. The member managing the LLC would mean that the trust is the one who manages it. So you have different options, but as a general principle, it's pretty common that we can use that trust to own your LLC in those states that allow it. Question 4 this week, I'm moving to Minnesota, so where should I draft my will? So in this case, the caller is actually in Kansas right now and is getting ready to move to Minnesota. And the question is, when are you making that move? So in this case, it's going to be in the next few weeks. So it makes sense to do a Minnesota-based estate plan because it's a permanent move to Minnesota, and it will normally take us a couple of weeks to put together all the documents, get them reviewed, and get them signed. But I've had this conversation many times with clients where they're in one state and they're moving to a new one at some point. And the question is, do you want to hold off on your estate plan until you move to the new state, or do you want to do it now? In those situations, my advice is normally do your estate plan now. You never know what's going to happen in life, and especially if you don't have a firm move date, what we can do is make sure we have that estate plan in place. And then when you move to the new state, what you do is you meet with a local attorney in that state, and they can review the documents you did in your prior state and see whether or not you need to do updates. So we commonly would need to update like statutory forms, like a statutory power of attorney, a healthcare directive, because it may look different in your new state. But generally, your will should be valid across all 50 states and in most countries around the world. So once you've created that will, that's all set. The question is, are there different things you can take advantage of? So if you're moving, for example, from New York to Minnesota, New York does not have informal probate. Minnesota does. So what we would likely want to do is update that will. So we have a Minnesota will that takes advantage of informal probate. That's something that wasn't available to you when you created your will in New York. And question 5 this week, do I automatically inherit property from my father when he passes away? So in this case, the caller has property that his father owned and jointly with his uncle. And the question is, when his father passed away, does he automatically inherit his father's share? Does the uncle inherit it? What happens to it? The first question whenever we are looking at situations like this is, did the father have a will? So in this case, the father did not have a will. So if the father had a will, we'd go with what the will says happens to that property interest. But if there is no will, then the next step is we look to your local laws and see what it says as far as inheritance. In the situation where the father and the uncle are going to own property together, the important place to look is the deed for the property. So how do they own it? If they own it as tenants in common, that means they each have a divisible share so that the father's share can then be inherited by the son if that's what the probate court decides it should be distributed as. However, if they owned it with what we call a right of survivorship, that means that when the father passes away, the uncle now owns that property 100%. So it's very important to look at the deed and figure out how that property was owned. So you don't automatically inherit from your parents. You don't automatically inherit from your siblings. You often automatically inherit from your spouse, depending upon what the asset is. So it's important to figure out what that specific asset is and how it's titled, and then you can determine how the inheritance will go. So those are our 5 questions for the week. If you like this video, you can hit the like or thumbs up button below. You can subscribe for future episodes on YouTube. You can submit a question for future episodes at the link below. And you can always go to 𝙃𝙀𝙍𝙀𝙀.com for more information or to set up a legal strategy session. It's getting a little colder here in Minnesota, so wherever you are, I hope you have a wonderful weekend.